If you're interested in becoming a graphic designer, or you're a self-taught designer and maybe never took a course on typography, then here's a crash course on typography. I took my first typography course in 2010 and have been heavily surrounded by type ever since. In this class, we're going to be reviewing this book called Thinking with Type by Ellen Lupton. A lot of this book is what I read and learned in my first typography class, and so I thought it'd be helpful if we went over that today. There's no way I'm going to be able to cover everything in this video, so look out for additional videos that will dive even deeper into all of these higher level topics. Typefaces are an essential resource for graphic designers, just as glass, stone, steel, and countless other materials are used by architects. So to know and understand typography as a tool is to know and understand the history of it, where it came from, how we ended up with the terms we use today, and the historical implications of each font you're going to use. When you know what you're doing with typography, it can help determine the design decisions you're going to make based on the strategy and needs for what you're about to design. So, first off, history. Technically, the history of typography begins with civilization and writing in general, but we won't go back that far. The most direct influence starts back in medieval days with scribes who carefully spent days on end writing each letter by hand. Then, in the early 15th century, Johannes Gutenberg invented movable type in Germany. Printing with metal type allowed for mass production. Italians quickly followed this method and moved away from Gutenberg's Gothic letter forms and introduced classic Roman Humanist letter forms. The printing press introduced terminology we still use today when it comes to typography. Gutenberg stored the metal letters in a cabinet of drawers called cases. The upper case held all caps, and the lower cases held the minuscule letters. And just like how there's human anatomy, a name for every muscle and bone, there's type anatomy. All letters sit on a baseline and are defined by a cap height or X height. Most letters have a stem, and with lowercase letters, they have ascenders and descenders. Characters like A's and B's have bowls. Some letters have a crossbar, other letters have finials, terminals, and spines. And just like there's genres of music, there's classifications of typefaces. The most commonly known classifications are serifs and sans serifs. Humanist letter forms are closely connected to calligraphy and the movement of the hand. Transitional and modern typefaces are more abstract and less organic. These three main groups correspond roughly to the Renaissance, Baroque, and Enlightenment periods in art and literature. Designers today continue to create new typefaces based on historic characters. Some typefaces can have a whole family of fonts that have specific sizes and weights that exist in the same style, like interstate light condensed or interstate bold compressed, and you could have regular and italic versions within a single typeface. Each of those are considered a font within a larger family. With the introduction of typewriters, we got monospace type, where each letters take up an equal width of space. And then, when computers were introduced, type turned into bit-mapped letter forms until vectors were introduced to create the smooth curves we see today. So let's go over some terminology and rules of typography. Letters gather into words, words build into sentences until we have blocks of text from headlines to captions and body text. It can flow column or box to another. Spacing and styling in typography is everything when it comes to the functional use of reading it. The typographer's art concerns not only the positive grain of letter forms, but the negative gaps between and around them. In letterpress printing, every space is constructed by a physical object, a blank piece of metal or wood. Thin strips of lead called leading divide the horizontal lines of type, and wider blocks of furniture hold the margins of the page. It's going to be really hard to read something if there's bad spacing or no spacing at all, which is why this has become so important. On the other hand, too much spacing can be just as difficult to read because your eye can get lost in so much space. Kerning is the space between two letters. Kerning two O's will look very different from kerning an A and V. A properly built font file will have this built into the file, but knowing how to kern can be important if the font file or program isn't doing that for you, or if you're creating a word mark or logo type for a brand. Tracking, on the other hand, is the consistent collective space between letters. Tracking headlines and larger blocks of text can look very different from tracking smaller blocks of text or body copy. Larger blocks of text will need less spacing. Smaller blocks of text will probably need more spacing. The font file has normal tracking built into it, but a designer can determine if they want to change it to positive tracking or negative tracking. Leading or line spacing should give the eye just enough space to travel between lines to the next one. Alignment refers to which side the text as a whole lines up on. Left aligned, right aligned can also be defined as flush left or flush right. And the edge that isn't aligned in both of the scenarios is called the rag. A bad rag is when it creates an ugly wedge or shape, so designers are there to create rags that aren't distracting to the reader. And then there's fully justified type, where both edges are even, but when this is poorly done, it can create awkward gaps called rivers in a large block of text. And lastly, we can't forget about centered type, which really only works with shorter lines of text. And when you do that, be aware of what words you're grouping to create a clean look that's also readable. Designers also need to be mindful of widows and orphans when it comes to blocks of text. Widows are the last line of a paragraph that's alone at the top of the next column or a page. And orphans are when a single word is at the end of a paragraph on its own line. Hierarchy is important because it creates an organization system for content, emphasizing some data and diminishing others. Good hierarchy helps the reader scan text easily, knowing where to enter and exit, and how to pick and choose among its offerings. Each level of hierarchy should be signaled by one or more cues, like a spatial cue or a graphic cue. The variations from there are endless. But a rule in hierarchy is to only use one or two cues. When you have too many, it can be redundant. Proper punctuation isn't just for writers, it's for designers who understand type too. Too many times I've seen inch marks used in place of proper quotation marks. Remember, quotation marks have distinct open and closed forms, or as I like to call them, curly, which is not the same as hatch marks, which are straight up and down. So if you didn't know that before, then I promise you probably won't be able to unsee it. And knowing the difference between a hyphen, N dash, and M dash can help with hierarchy. The last thing I want to cover today is optics and illusions when it comes to type design. Now that we've covered anatomy and spacing rules, it's also important to know the visual optics that are applied to a specific font or weight, and the illusions that are accounted for in each letter. This is especially important when selecting fonts and even when designing or modifying type for a word mark. Optical sizing is the practice of designing different versions of a font with consideration to how and where it'll be experienced. Whether you go big or go little, type crafted for specific sizes will give your typography the royal treatment. Micro, text, deck, display, headline, banner, big. These are some of the names used to describe optical sizes. Different cuts of a typeface family that have been designed to work within a certain range. Typically, a text font needs to have a taller X height, open apertures, and lower contrast, while display fonts can have more decorative nuances and contrast in the same typeface. Optical sizing accounts for these contexts and for how the nuances of character shape, spacing, and kerning impact both legibility and style. The reason letter forms always exist a certain way is because of illusions that occur with letters. For example, the top and bottom of curves of letters like a C and an O need to be designed with what's called an overshoot to appear to be the same size as letters with a straight bottom or top. Another example is with balance. B's and S's can easily look off balance if the top and bottom are exactly the same. That's why the bottom of those letters are usually slightly larger than the top. Same with crossbars. They aren't always in the same place throughout the set, and they aren't always vertically centered to the letter. I hope all of this was a helpful overview of typography. We went over the history, anatomy, classification, spacing, terminology, rules, optics, and illusions of type. Let me know if you have any questions about this in the comments below, or if there's anything else you'd like me to cover. And as always, please don't forget to subscribe to see more educational content like this.